Welcome to the Legacy Tree podcast. We're the team at Legacy Tree Genealogists, and this is where we talk about the real side of family history. The surprises, the roadblocks, the emotions, and the stories that don't always fit neatly into a pedigree chart. From DNA discoveries to archival finds, cultural history to personal moments, we have honest conversations about what genealogy actually looks like and why it matters. Because when it comes to preserving what matters most, you deserve to put your family history in our hands. In this episode, we're joined by two voices deeply rooted in the world of genetic genealogy. Sarah Stoddard, an advanced researcher on Legacy Tree Genealogists' DNA team, shares how her lifelong love of storytelling led her to genealogy. With 15 years of experience, Sarah specializes in DNA, US, and German research, and is especially known for combining genetic evidence with traditional records to solve complex and emotionally meaningful cases. We're also honored to welcome Richard Hill, founder of DNA Favorites and a pioneer in genetic genealogy. After discovering as a teenager that he was adopted, Richard spent decades using emerging DNA technologies to uncover his origins, work that earned national attention and reshaped how many approach DNA research today. Together, Sarah and Richard reflect on their personal journeys with DNA, the evolution of genetic genealogy, and the powerful stories that can emerge when science and family history intersect.
Hi, nice to meet you. So I'm Sarah Stoddard. I live in Utah. I graduated in 2009 with a degree in family history from BYU. Both of my parents were really interested in genealogy, so it was just kind of always something in the background of, growing up with their interest in family history and some really interesting experiences they had. And my dad was involved in a Y-DNA testing project for his surname line. I thought it was kind of interesting. I read some of your background and how you kind of found out you were adopted by going to a doctor's office, because my dad's sort of jump into doing Y-DNA stuff started with a hospital visit where he and my mom were there for an ultrasound for my younger brother when she was very pregnant, and they called his name over the speaker, or her name, to go back for the appointment. And some guy came running up to them and was like, "Hey, is your last name Woodall?" And he had answers basically on my dad's family line that he'd been stuck on for years because of a family that came to Missouri after the Civil War, and then the parents died and nobody knew beyond that where they were from. So he connected with these other Woodall researchers. They all thought they had the same ancestor back in Virginia in the 1600s, and then they did Y-DNA testing, and that was not the case. So that, kind of got me knowledgeable about DNA. And then when I heard about autosomal DNA years later, I was really excited about that because I had a friend that was adopted. I had a great grandfather that was adopted. And I'm like, oh, like this could help with those kind of things. So that was after I graduated and I had two small kids. And so I was just kind of learning as I went with my DNA, with my grandparents' DNA. I got all four of my grandparents tested because they were all living at the time. And so it's just been a really fun adventure to learn. And then I did the internship at Legacy Tree in 2019 with the DNA team, and I've been working with them ever since doing DNA research.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Well, my name is Richard Hill, and as Sarah mentioned, I was adopted. I was what you call a late discovery adoptee because I never knew I was adopted. I just found out accidentally at age 18. But because I was about ready to go off to college and everything, I was more focused on my future than I was in the past. So I really didn't do anything about it until 14 years later. And then I decided to get started in looking, and I searched for many years. I identified who my biological mother had been. Unfortunately, she had died about a year after my birth, so I was not able to connect with her, but I found a brother. And then I kept searching for like 20 some years off and on, trying to identify who my father had been. And I was pretty much stuck until I happened to hear a friend who was into genealogy mention Y-DNA testing and how that worked, up the direct paternal line. So I decided to try it, and I did a Y-DNA test with family tree DNA. And through that testing, I was able to identify the last name of my birth father because the surnames generally pass down that same paternal line. And fortunately, in my case, the surname had not changed, other than it obviously changed with me when I was adopted. But once I knew that, I continued to work and I found a likely candidate in that a man that my mother surely knew who had that same last name. So I ended up getting in touch with a niece of his, and she helped me convince um, some other family members to do some Y-DNA tests. Well, no, it wasn't the Y-DNA test. I already did that. Uh, Turns out the man who I thought was my father was one of five brothers. And all five would have inherited the same Y chromosome from their father. So I had five candidates and didn't know which one for sure had been my father because they were all living in the same area about the time of my conception, and could any of them could have known my birth mother. And so I did convince a child of each man to do what was called a sibling test with another lab. And that lab, that's basically just a paternity test. It just checks about 16 markers, and it cannot tell you with a certainty that you get in a parent-child relationship, but with trying to measure siblings, it's only able to calculate a probability that two people are half siblings, which is what I was looking for in my case. And it did point to the man who was my most likely suspect. And I thought, well, hey, I found him. So family was pretty happy with those results, and I found new siblings and so on. And then the autosomal DNA testing came along originally through 23andMe, and then family tree DNA and others. So I got a couple more of my relatives to test, and it turned out that that was the wrong man. My father was actually a different brother. So I had to change everything around, and some of my presumed half siblings became cousins, and some of my cousins became half siblings. So it was a little bit chaotic, but I think everybody worked out to be really good to finally know the results. Since then, well, first of all, I got into genealogy because I'd never been a genealogist. There was no real interest in my family growing up. But now that I had a biological line to research, I did get into genealogy and researched my birth father's line and my birth mother's line quite a ways back, and then later started researching the lines of my wife's side for her family. So most people start out as genealogists and then get into DNA and add on to that become genetic genealogists, and I did it backwards. I got into genetic genealogy first, and then got into genealogy. So it was kind of a different way to do it. I created a website to tell other people about what I was doing. That website got a lot of traffic over the years. I no longer have that website. I have a different one. My current website is dnafavorites.com, and did a lot of speaking and writing for various publications on that, and started giving presentations. And that's basically what I do now is I give presentations both in person occasionally although obviously since we all learned to use Zoom during COVID, most of my presentations are virtual. And I've got a number of presentations that I offer that all on DNA topics. And that's kind of what I do is kind of my part-time gig in retirement.
Well, thanks. That's cool to get to know you a little bit. So, when I was reading, watching stuff about your story, it was interesting to me how many times you probably had to like change your understanding of, okay, I'm not biologically the child of my parents. I was adopted. And then, well, I think this man might be my biological father because that's who my biological mother named. But then maybe this is actually who it is based on the DNA. Oh, but there's this other kind of DNA. It's actually this guy. Like that's a lot of change, a lot of whiplash for your own like sense of yourself and your history. And how did that feel to have that change multiple times for you?
It was a wild and crazy ride, I'll tell you that, because you get all excited when you think you found your answer, and then it turns out that answer is wrong, and then you try again, and you go and follow another lead, and that one is a dead end, and it was that for years, and then a lot of just really wild and quirky coincidences and things like that happened that make it all come together, and that's why it's a lot of people in my you know first family and my adoptive family um, all kept hearing more and more of this story. Everyone kept saying you should write a book. And that's why I did. I wrote my book, which is Finding Family, My Search for Roots and the Secrets in My DNA. And that tells the whole story. And I enjoyed putting that together. And I was able to do it because I kept meticulous notes through that 25-year process. Every time I talked to someone or had correspondence with someone or was able to get a record out of the state of Michigan, I kept it all, kept notes. I had a gigantic pile of papers, and that's what enabled me to go back all those years later and put together a comprehensive and I think pretty interesting story.
Yeah, that's so important to like track the steps that you take. I know when whether I'm doing my own research or research for clients, like first of all, if you don't keep good notes, you can lose track of what you've done, what things
Hmm.
you've already tried, and you lose the sense of what the journey was if you only share with people what the answer was at the end. So that's great that you were able to keep those notes and to share that story. And do you feel like sharing your story, like was that obviously you're sharing that hoping it'll help other people or, teach them something, but for you, did that feel like that helped you sort of understand your own journey better and come to terms with it a little bit better?
Absolutely, it did. And I really have to give my wife a lot of credit too, because when I first started doing this, I basically was trying to just do a how I did it book,
Hmm.
that took the steps so that other adoptees could follow these steps that applied to them and find birth family too. And then my wife said, you got to get your emotion into this. You got to, you know, think about your feelings and so on. And so with her urging, as I went through this process, you know, I tried to drag up the memories of how I felt at the time, and I was able to do that, and I was able to inject a lot of personal feelings and emotion and thoughts and memories and so on into the story, and I think it made it a whole lot better book than if it had just been a how-to manual.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something I've found, especially with like helping adoptees or people with unknown paternity or things like that. It can be such a journey of like, it can unmoor you a little bit from your anchors of what you think about, about yourself. And it's so helpful to have someone like your wife along with you on the journey who's kind of your steady rock, your person that
Hmm.
knows who you are and can help ground you. And that's honestly something I tell people, whether it's a spouse or a friend that's helping them, like it's so helpful to have a person who's there on the journey with you, but like it's your story and they're kind of your support person there. So that's wonderful that you were able to have her help you in that way and help you later remember things and
Hmm.
make your writing better.
Yes, it did. And then another thing that I think was interesting too was that, and I think this would apply in many cases with adoptee searches, is I never had to give up my old family, the family that I grew up with, the
Hmm.
cousins that I knew throughout my life. Uh, and then I got all these new family members that were biologically related to me, but I had missed, you know, 60
Yeah.
years of living or so with them. Um, I've got all this family, and I didn't have to give up the old one to enjoy the new one. So, and I think that's the case. I believe you can't have too much family. And though
I
some people
agree.
say they have, well, most people just have two branches to their family tree. I've really got, four because I've got my paternal and maternal sides on each of those families.
Yeah, I have a nephew and a few nieces who are adopted, and it was an open adoption kind of situation. They were a little bit older, they knew their birth parents, and it's been interesting to watch them as they grow up, try to figure that out, which is a little bit different than you figuring it out later after people have passed away, maybe,
Hmm.
or are a lot older, of
Right.
them as they're forming their sense of identity, of trying to understand, okay, this is my birth family, this is my adoptive family. Do I have to choose between who am I going to try to be like? Who do I want to spend time with? And it's messy. It's not always easy, but I'm
Hmm.
really grateful for them that they're in a time and in a situation where they can try to have relationships and draw good things from both families because we love them and we want them to be the best people they can be, and if that means that they're drawing from both families to do that, I think that's amazing, and hopefully both families can be mature and supportive about that, which it sounds like in your case you had a lot of positive interactions with your adoptive family, with your biological relatives as you discovered them. Was any part of this journey hard for them, though, on either side?
Well, as far as my adoptive parents go, my uh, they never talked about it, when I was a kid. I didn't know I was adopted. In a way, I was lucky because most adoptees grow up with a lot of just inherent trauma of being adopted, of wondering why these people gave you up and where they are and all of this. And I missed all that because I never knew I was adopted until I was 18. And then I was old enough to understand that sometimes women that give birth are not able to take that care of that child and choose adoption as a route, as my birth mother apparently had done. So um, again, I was lucky that I was old enough to and mature enough to handle that without a great deal of trauma. Um, as far as my adoptive family goes, Um, once I found out about it, I chose not to bring it up. So I didn't even mention it to them once at 18, once I found out. Because I thought, well, I was about ready to go off for college, and I thought, well, I was their only child, and they were already a little stressed out about me moving away, and that, well, I'm not going to bring this up, make an issue of it now. So I I didn't, and I just kind of not entirely forgot about it, but just really went way in the back burner of my head. And then, say 14 years later, my dad, my adoptive father, had a stroke and was hospitalized. And while he was there, I would visit him and talk, and he suddenly brought up my adoption one day, just assuming I knew somehow that I must have found out it somehow, and I did. And he shattered some of my assumptions. For one thing, I assumed that my birth mother had been someone that they had no clue who it was. I figured it was a completely anonymous adoption, and they wouldn't know anything about her. Well, it turns out she was kind of a friend type of situation. Her mother, anyway, was a friend of a friend. So um, she and young girls then always left town, when they were pregnant, because you didn't want, it was so embarrassing to be pregnant back then without being married. So she was from the Detroit area. My adoptive parents were living in Lansing, and she actually came up to Lansing and lived with them in their apartment for the last 5 months of her pregnancy. They took her to the hospital. I was born. She went back to Detroit. My adoptive parents took me home. So another reason I was lucky was, I bonded with them immediately. I didn't spend some time in foster care or an orphanage or, anything like that. So that was good. And then my mother still didn't know that I knew. And I didn't actually speak to her about it until after I found my brother on my birth mother's side. And then I thought, well, I better tell her. So I wrote her a letter about it, a nice letter, I think, and let her know that I had done this and that I knew and that she would always be my mom, and try to just reassure her as much as possible and ask her to call me and talk about it. And well, she did call me. We talked about it very briefly, had one phone conversation about it, and then she never brought it up again the rest of her life. So it was hard for her. I think she had, well, there was, I think, and back then, and this is in the 40s, um, I think some women felt embarrassed that they couldn't produce children on their own. Um, and I think for her, it was kind of a thing she just didn't want to talk about, and she didn't want to admit to anybody that she was not my biological mother.
So I've sort of been on the other end of, somebody searching sometimes with all four of my grandparents testing. Three out of the four, I've had, some surprise cousin who was adopted or didn't know their parentage or whatever come up, probably about 6 or 7 instances. But with, someone who maybe they DNA test and everything lines up with what they always thought about their family, but they have someone come looking who says, I'm adopted. I don't know who my father or grandfather or whoever is. Can you help me? Like, what would you say to someone in that situation? How can they be helpful to the person that's searching?
Well, I always encourage people, DNA testers, genealogists, anybody like that, if you are contacted by an adoptee, you could be the only person that can provide the clue they need to find that family. And I encourage people to be very open and helpful. Um, don't like clam up and say, "Oh, I got to protect somebody" and stuff. Let the parties involved work it out. You don't know that that person wouldn't be overjoyed to find out that they had a child that had grown up and wanted to contact them. So I would not make any assumptions about that. I would be helpful and and let them work it out.
And did you find in your, process of contacting people, whether it was through DNA or through traditional research methods, like what are some tips you would say for you're the one reaching out and trying to get information and trying to connect with relatives and connect the dots in your tree as far as, having courtesy and just best practices for contacting, whether it's DNA matches, potential relatives, people like that?
Well, in the case of adoptees, I always recommend that if you are contacting a relatively close DNA match that you think might be somehow connected to your birth family, that you don't bring up adoption right away. Because again, there are people who feel very protective, like, oh, this is some deep, dark secret, and I don't want to help you. If you just tell them that, hey, we're related somehow based on this DNA test, and I'd like to compare family trees and kind of figure out, where we connect. And I think you'll get a lot more results that way than if you use the big A word and start off with that right away.
So I've also ran across this with my own family or with clients where it may not be an adoption, but whether it's the DNA or the records, you run across something in your family tree that was not what you expected. Just for one example, my dad's family had a lot of stories of Native American ancestry, and the DNA showed that that was not true, but actually showed that they probably had some distant African ancestry and probably some connections to Melungeon populations in Appalachia, which is, that was actually kind of a
Mhm.
common thing for them to say rather than to say they had African ancestry. But whether it's that or whether it's the person you thought was your great grandparent isn't your great grandparent, or you thought they had a certain career and they had a different career, or maybe they had a criminal record. Like our ancestors,
Mhm.
they were complicated people just like we are,
That's
and you
right.
can find surprises. And so, just how do you approach that with the right attitude and sort of the right way of researching so that you're opening yourself up to more truth rather than closing yourself off?
I think anybody that does a DNA test has to be prepared for the fact that you may find something that surprises you. It may not always be a missing ch unknown child or something like that. That's the more rare example, but you may find things like examples like you talked about. Um, I know in my one of my Y-DNA matches, it's actually one of my closer Y-DNA matches, um, doesn't have the same surname as my biological father. He had a surname change. And fortunately, because of research, he found out what had happened, and it was his great grandfather, I guess, that was running from the law and changed his name. Uh, these where that might have been scandalous at the time. It's just a kind of a funny story, like, generations later. So a lot of this stuff I think, are things that nothing to get too upset about. They're interesting, even fascinating, I would say.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, the generations that have passed make a difference. So sometimes, myself or I talk to other researchers and we swap stories about, oh, like this guy ran around to three continents and had three different wives. That's a true
Hmm.
story of a sailor that's a different distant cousin of mine. And now it's kind of we chuckle a little bit about it, but if that were somebody's, actual brother today or sibling, child, father, they might feel a little bit different about that. And so I think taking that kind of stuff into account with how you share these stories is important too. But I think also people who've researched their trees for a long time or have been the people that gather family stories, you can sometimes get very tied to your story being a certain way, or I researched this, so it's got to be the right thing. And I see that in novices, I see that in people with years of experience. And I think it's so important to, you know, gather your proof like you did, gather your notes of what you did, but also be open to new evidence, to parts of the story you didn't know, to information from other sources that you didn't have access to before. Like we we need to be constantly learning. I think it's a lot like science in that way. Science 100 years ago on how the universe works is different than it is now. And it's not that the universe has changed. We've just gained more tools to understand it.
Yeah, when I was doing, I had identified my birth father's family through the Y-DNA test, but I still had five brothers, and we
Hmm.
didn't know, which one had been my father. Well, all five were deceased, and four of the five wives were deceased. So there was a little sensitivity about the one wife who was still surviving, if her husband, fortunately, because of the timing, uh, it would have happened before they were married.
Hmm.
So it would not have been as bad as if it happened after, they were married. But I think the feeling that we all got as we were kind of wrestling with this is that what might have been, a scandal at the time, now that all of these people are deceased and everything like that, it's no longer a scandal, but now it's just history. It's just history. And
Hmm.
good or bad, that's what it is. It's just history. There's no real, I don't think, real shame or anything like that attached to it.
So we've both you and I have been around DNA testing and aware of the changes that have happened in the field over the past, 15, 20 plus years. But I think for a lot of people, especially people my age or younger, it's kind of always been around. And so they may think that they understand what it is, but what are some common, misconceptions or misunderstandings that you find that people still have about DNA, even if they think they know how it works?
Well, I think one of the basic ones is that you take a DNA test and automatically get a family tree.
Not true. Yeah, I've seen
Yeah,
that
it's
too.
there's still a lot of work to be done, and I think people, underestimate that. Um, uh, Again, another thing, of course, is that they if they do have an understanding of their family tree, they assume it's right, and they're just going to verify it. And it turns out they may disprove parts of it that were just simply wrong. And even I chuckle because I get contacted with people who um, saying that, hey, yeah, we're connected, and our common ancestor is, and this is through a paper trail, not so much DNA, but they'll say, yeah, our common ancestor and it's 10, 12, 15 generations back and stuff like that. And they're all excited about this. And knowing that, I think I've read that it's something like about a 5% chance per generation that the man on the birth certificate is not the biological father. And you
Yeah.
multiply that 5% by 10, 12 generations, and it's fiction, your tree
You're going to run across it somewhere.
probably isn't biologically correct by the time you get back that far. At least
Yeah.
parts of it are probably way out of whack.
Yeah. And that's kind of what happened, I think, with the Woodall Y surname project that my dad was part of. So you had all these Woodall researchers in the 90s, early 2000s that were in different parts of the country that had paper trails back to this particular family in Virginia. And what they thought was one big family group turned into basically four family groups.
Mhm.
One was a Turns out we did our research, and one of them, he had the Woodall surname, but it was his mother's surname because he was born illegitimately. Another
Mhm.
man, we're still not entirely sure how this happened, but he has a Native American paternal line. And then basically everybody else comes from two particular sons of the 1600s ancestor, and everybody that comes from the son William has one haplogroup. Everybody that comes from the son John has another haplogroup. So it's the 1600s. We don't know what happened. We don't know if there was misattributed paternity, a step parent
Right.
situation, or maybe even there were multiple people in the area with the same name. And, there could have been two Williams or two Johns, and the one that we descend from isn't actually the son of that man. He's somebody else with the same name. And so it's just, it sometimes gives you a different story, but that story is definitely one worth learning about. And I know one of the things I found in an email from my dad, he talked about when everybody in this group was kind of disappointed. Well, we don't all match. Our tree, our paper trail has kind of been exploded. And he's like, look, like this is valuable. And the fact that we have all worked together on this, even though our Y lines don't all match, like look at the benefit and the friendships and the relationships we've built in that
Mhm.
process.
Right. Sometimes it's the journey that's the more important than the result.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think has been fun as I've gone on, journeys with my DNA and my grandparents' DNA is the people I've been able to connect with along the way that I wouldn't have connected with otherwise. I have a cousin in Sweden who her mother traveled in the US and came back home and had a baby, or her grandmother had her mother after she came back home to Sweden, and that's how we're related. And if I hadn't had my grandfather do a DNA and she hadn't have done DNA, like we never would have connected, and we have a connection now. And I have, a bunch of other stories like that, not even always people that have that kind of a question, but just other people that are out there researching the ancestors that I care about and they care about them too. And we've been able to connect because we've matched on a DNA site. And it's been really, it makes the world feel really small too when you can make these
Mhm.
connections with people in other places, and that, your ancestors haven't known each other maybe for generations, but your family.
Right. And there can be continued surprises. In my case, since I wrote my book, and I'm in all the major databases for the autosomal tests. I keep getting surprise matches showing up. I've had one new half sibling show up since the book was written on my father's side. I've had three or four cousins show up that were um, children produced by one of his, well, actually about uh, two other of his brothers that had children. So yeah, it's been interesting, and these are new relationships that I've joined. People that I've talked to on, start out talking by email, and then you talk on the phone, and then in some cases I've actually been able to meet these people, and it's been fun. And then sometimes you get one that for whatever reason doesn't want to go there. I got a match to a cousin that on one of the DNA tests, and was real excited, and she contacted me and told me, says, "Oh, I see we're a match," and he says, she gave me the four names of her surnames of her grandparents, and none of them matched at all, and I realized where she was from Texas, and that my all of my father's family started out in Texas and grew up there. And I was quickly able to determine that, yeah, one of my uncles was her father. But it was a kind of a delicate situation because obviously it would have been a surprise to her. So I kind of, hinted at her that I had information on this if she wanted to pursue this further, that I could help her. And she just kind of backed off and says, no, I think I'll leave things alone. And that was her right. She
Yeah.
did, she chose, went, whoops, I don't really want to know. And, if you don't, then that's fine too.
Yeah. Something I've thought about, like, because I've had my grandparents test, one of my grandfathers passed away about 9 years ago. And yet, I still had someone reach out to me a couple years ago who was searching, and turned out to be related through my grandfather's family through one of his cousins, and he was the youngest cousin in the family and was the only one who could have tested because he was alive at the time that
Hmm.
testing came about. And so we were able to help this cousin identify who his biological father was, who turned out to have died in high school from a disease that ran in the family that took a lot of people young. But anyways, I think about that as, my grandfather's been gone for 9 years. I'm the custodian of his DNA results and anybody who might reach out to me. And that's something I don't know if you've thought about or had discussions about as, as people get older and pass away, like what happens to the custody of their DNA results and who's going to look after that. And, you know, it's still out there for people to look at and to try and
Hmm.
figure out their family trees with, but we're going to get more and more to a point as time goes on where there's a lot of testers in the database that are no longer living.
Yeah, and it's not just the DNA side of things. There was back once I knew who my father was, and I was researching his uh, direct paternal line. I get back to a man who was born in Virginia in 1742. Um, but turns out Virginia was a burned county. Those damn Yankees, burned the courthouse and destroyed all the records. And I have, through my search for that line, I have encountered several cousins and the distant cousins that we're all researching the same line and we're all stuck at the same point.
Yep.
And one of the women, it was a woman in Texas that I corresponded with and talked on the phone a couple of times. And she had been researching for years, and she seemed to really know a lot about the family, but she was a very much older woman. She um, everything was in paper. She didn't have a computer other than she used the library. She volunteered at a library, and she used the library computer for email. But none of her records were digitized in any way. And and she was very protective about it too, because like she would give me some information, but it was kind of attitude like I did all this work and I'm not just going to share it with somebody that new that comes along. They got to work just as hard as I did to get that information. And she was really up there in age, and apparently she was the only one in her family that had any interest in this. And I'm sure she's long gone now. And I always wondered whatever happened to all those records, because she had done a tremendous job, but it was all sitting in paper in her house, and she's gone. You know what happens to it? Her kids probably come in and dump it. You know.
Yeah. Well, and that's something we've had a lot of projects at Legacy Tree where it's somebody that has, whether it's somebody that's gathered information like that or somebody that has a brick wall question like your group of relatives have, where they've done a lot in their lives and they want to be able to leave a legacy to their children or their relatives or, preserve the research that's done. And that's really a satisfying thing about my work is when I put together a report, we put together binders, we put together a website, we're trying to make something that will last and that can be shared with others that are interested in the family, even, you know, when the person who asked for the research isn't around anymore. That's something that they can leave as a legacy for the future. And so I think that's so important.
I agree. And that's one reason I have, you know, kept all of my genealogical research, which is all on, computer. Um, and for my kids, so they know, and not only on my side, but on my wife's side. So they have all of their combined research. They're, not terribly interested at this age, but a lot of people pick this up as they get older.
Yeah.
You probably noticed that the demographics of genealogists is definitely skewed older when people
Yes.
finally have time to, they're not so busy and wrapped up with their career and family and stuff that they finally have time to get into this.
Well, and I think as you get to that point in life, you start, reflecting a little more on your life and where
Hmm.
did I come from and what am I going to pass on when I'm gone? So if someone's just getting to that point and maybe is just starting with genealogy and particularly with DNA, like let's say somebody gets a Black Friday DNA kit this Christmas and they've never done much with genealogy before. Obviously, they're gonna hopefully spit in the tube and send it in, but what else can they do to get started or to get ready to make best use of their DNA results once they're ready?
Well, I think you've got to get yourself some kind of an education on what to do with all of this now that you've started getting it. Um, I have, again, on my website, the DNAfavorites.com, I have a number of pages organized and just kind of the basic things, and I've created that as a kind of a basic tool. So if people go through it from page after page after page, they get a great overview of the basics of genetic genealogy. And then I include a lot of links to resources, links to educational resources, links to like Facebook groups, links to blogs, links to all kinds of things like that. Um, and so I think that's a good starting point. And then there are, other lots and lots of other good resources. I think once you get into it, I think so far that to me the best single book on it is Blaine Bettinger's book, I think it's called The Family Tree Guide to Genetic Genealogy, or I'm not even sure now the exact title of it, but Blaine Bettinger is the author, and that's a really good overall manual on DNA. And then you've got the like webinars, like the Legacy Family Tree webinars are great. They've got over 2,000 webinars on genealogy and over 200 of them on DNA testing. I've done some presentations that are in their library, and I think those are another great learning tool to use. So books and in those webinars that have been saved and all of that, I would recommend.
And I know you talk about these things a little bit on your website and some of the references you mentioned talk about these things, but I think it's important for people to be aware of kind of three things. First of all, there's different types of DNA testing. You talked about the Y-DNA
Hmm.
testing. There's the
Yeah.
autosomal, which I think is what most people are familiar with the
Hmm.
cousin matches from any side of your family. And then there's mitochondrial DNA, which is from your direct maternal line. So mother to mother to mother to mother. Those sons also get it from their mother. And we don't have a lot of time to go over this, but there's different ways you can use each of those types of DNA to help with your research. There's also different testing companies that each have their advantages. And I know you and I are both on the same page of, being at all the major sites because
Yes.
there will be different matches at each site. There are different tools at each site, and
Hmm.
that's going to be the most helpful thing you can do with testing. Some of the
Yeah.
sites do allow you to do uploads as opposed to buying one of their tests, so you can transfer data from one site to another. And then there's other external tools that you can use to help you better
Hmm.
understand your DNA. Do you have, a couple of those that are just kind of basics that you really like to use to, you've got an ancestry test, you've got a MyHeritage test, whatever it is, what are some of the outside tools that are helpful for helping you understand your DNA results?
Well, I think probably the most fundamental one, and again, would be and again, this is from Blaine Bettinger. This is
Yeah.
the shared Centimorgan project. Um, he started maybe 10 years ago, asking people who had found who had measured relationships with family members to report, how many centimorgans did they have in common with an aunt or an uncle or a first cousin or a second cousin or a first cousin once removed, and all these different relationships. And he now has over tens of thousands, I don't know exactly how many data points. And then he's massaged it with statistical techniques to take out the complete outliers where people just got it wrong. And so anyway, he has this really nice chart that you can sign it. You can find it on dnapainter.com. And then it's a very nice looking chart. So for a given relationship like a first cousin, you can see how many centimorgans you share on average with the first cousin, and then the range that people have been reported as low as this and as high as this, because there is a certain amount of randomness in the way that the DNA passes down. So there's a range there. That's a very good tool. And then DNA Painter has a tool on their website where you can um, enter how many centimorgans you share with someone, and then it shows up the probabilities, and it'll say maybe there's a 70% probability that it's a first cousin, uh, and a bunch of other half relationships that work out to about that same amount, or maybe a 30% chance that it's a first cousin once removed. And so you get the probabilities. Those are probably the most useful things that I just refer to all the time.
Yeah. I think something people don't realize is as the relationships get more distant, how variable the amounts can be and how sometimes you don't even match a third or a fourth cousin. I have one of my favorite third cousins that I collaborate with on research, and he matches my sister, but not me. And that
Hmm.
that bothers him because I'm the one doing genealogy and we're the one that talk, and he doesn't match me, but he matches her and he matches my dad. And so that's something I try to tell people too, especially if you're going to do a historical problem. You may
Yes.
not have the DNA segments that are needed to answer the question. Those may be your parent or your aunt or your cousin. And so sometimes you've got to test multiple people. And one of the things I've been excited about, we've seen a lot of change and a lot of development in the field over time, is some of these new features that some of the testing companies have come out with that not only allow you to look at, okay, I share this much DNA with a person with a match, but here's how much the DNA they share with somebody else that we both
Hmm.
match, because then that allows you to start figuring out the family relationships. But I'm just curious, whether it's recent tools or things that might be coming in the future. What are things that you're really excited about, new developments in the genealogy testing realm of research?
Well, some of the tools you mentioned there are certainly important. Anything that gives you the kind of the shared matches are all very useful. Clustering tools are very interesting. That help you cluster your matches into groups that may all be descended from the same common ancestor. Um, One thing that it's just a recent development that I'm excited about, though I think it will take quite a while before we see anything, and that is that MyHeritage announced recently that they are now going to start using whole genome testing in their autosomal DNA test. It's not uh, the kind of real expensive test where they have to go over maybe 30 times to make sure they got everything right for medical purposes. It's only like two passes or something, but it's good enough and they've done enough testing to know it's good enough for genealogy purposes. And they have, as a fact, I just found out they are now actually doing it. Every test that they get now is being tested on the whole genome testing. And initially, I don't think it's going to make any difference at all. But with all that extra data, in the longer run, I think there's going to be advantages that we just can't even imagine right now, but I think there will be.
Yeah. I've been really excited by recent developments in both Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA testing, where they're just getting, with the big Y700 test and with other things with mitochondrial DNA, they're getting more precise. They're getting better at being able to predict how recently two people share an ancestor within a smaller time frame, or which, family lines are most closely related to one another. And
Yeah.
I'm really excited about the potential of that. I'm also excited that, you know, for the future of younger generations, different populations being tested. Right now, with autosomal DNA or even with Y-DNA, you can kind of say, oh, if you have ancestry from these countries, you're likely to have some good matches. These countries, maybe not as much, but that's changing as more people are testing and younger
Yeah.
generations are testing. And I'm just really excited for more people to be able to make discoveries with this tool.
Yeah. I can see we're running out of time, and I think we're going to need to wrap this up. This has been fascinating and a fun discussion, but
Yeah,
uh,
thank you. Thank you for talking. I know we could probably talk for hours more, but I'm glad to be able to have this conversation and to learn a little bit more about your journey and for us to talk about the exciting world of DNA and genealogy research.
I agree. Thank
Well,
you.
you have a good rest of your day. Thank you for coming.
You do that too. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Legacy Tree podcast. If you're ready to take the next step in your own family history journey, we'd be honored to help. Put your family history in our hands and learn more about working with our team at legacytree.com.